Without further ado, I want to introduce our keynote speaker today. Stephen Benson is a professional and a licensed clinical psychologist that we recruited to talk to us today about working with elders and other persons with diminished capacity. As you can read in your program, he's a licensed clinical psychologist specializing in adult and older adult psychotherapy, testing, and consultation. He's originally from the West Coast and received his training out there in Los Angeles and Seattle, as well as San Antonio, but he's been practicing here in Kansas and Wichita since 2000. Dr. Benson provides a variety of services for individuals ages 18 and older. He also specializes with older adults and is recognized as an expert in geriatrics, frequently consulting with medical and legal professionals, social services agencies, nursing facilities, and families, and we're certainly glad to have him here and want to welcome him to the stage.
Everybody hear me okay? Is this loud enough for people in the back? All right, I'm a wanderer when I talk. I can't stand still very long. So, my name is Stephen. Please don't call me Dr. Benson. That's only useful if you want a reservation. I'm not a very formal person, so if you have questions as we go, please just raise your hand. I'm one of those people that prepares for stuff like this. We have 90 slides. We have 90 minutes to talk. So we're going to fly through some of this stuff. We're going to cover as much stuff as you want, as much stuff as you need. If you want me to stop and focus on something a little bit more, I'm happy to do that. And we're just going to kind of work our way through. A lot of what we're going to focus on today is really abnormal aging. So I want to kind of start off by talking about normal aging, because it can get depressing if we keep talking about abnormal aging as each of us is getting older. Normal aging. Our relationships start to shift. We start to change our focus. When we're younger, we're trying to get knowledge, accumulate wealth, acquire things. We start building families and relationships. As we get older, though, we start to trim that down. So one of the normal aspects of aging is a theory called socio-emotional selectivity theory. This is what happens when you let doctors name something instead of marketers. It's a horrible name, but here's what it means. We treat our relationships like a rose bush. When the branches are dead on a rose bush, one of the things you do is you clip the branch off. The idea behind clipping the branch off is it allows the other branches to flourish. That happens in our relationships as well. Those relationships that suck energy from us, we're better off clipping them off, essentially, allowing the other branches to flourish. What happens as people age is they pare down their relationships. So instead of having 20 or 30 friends, they pare it down to 10, to 5. And that's healthy for them. The energy goes into the relationships that are the most meaningful. The flip side of that coin, as we'll talk about, is that one of the things that happens as you age, people die. Everybody has an expiration date. We know that people are going to die. That means that those social circles get smaller and smaller. And what we'll talk about down the road here in a little bit is how the smaller social circles put people at higher vulnerability for abuse and for being taken advantage of. So, we age, we work. Ultimately, the goal is to retire. And this is a relatively new concept in the United States. This really didn't take off until about the 1920s. Nobody retired. Everybody worked. Partly because the median age of living, mean age, was probably 60 years old, 50 years old. People didn't live long enough. In the 1920s, after the Great Depression, they introduced retirement. Social Security starts to kick in, and that is essentially started as a way to kick older adults out of the workforce so that the younger people who were unemployed could have something to do. It was essentially a way to get rid of the dead weight, to have somebody else come in. Now that has transformed over the years, obviously, but that still kind of persists, right? We know that there's age discrimination that takes place. We don't talk about it, but we know it's there. We know that if people get laid off the job in their 50s, it's much harder for them to find a job than if you get laid off in your 40s. Same theories are kind of there. So what we have, retirement is an invitation to stop developing. You retire, you stop. One of the things that we know is that if people just quit, quality of life goes way down. We know from the research that if people are actively engaged, if they work part-time, if they volunteer, if they mentor, quality of life goes way up. This is especially true for males. And we know that they have much more productive years. The research also shows that for many people, retirement is a deterioration, a loss of status, and a loss of a valuable resource. You know, if you work in the technology sector, you know about brain drain. You want to keep valuable workers, you don't want them to get sucked out into something else. It's a brain drain. That's essentially true with older adults too. The wisdom and the years that they offer get pushed aside for lower wage, fewer benefits, maybe not as big of a pension, and so on. The business concerns get thrown in there. So what ends up happening is that everybody gets focused on building money. Everybody gets focused on building wealth. And I know you guys are in that business. And so everything gets put in that area. But the emotional elements of retirement are overlooked. I would argue that the financial piece is less than 50% of successful retirement. I think that the emotional and psychological piece is much greater than we give it credit for. Retirement takes time. It's a process. It's not an event. It's not when I hit 65 or 62, I'm just going to quit. We have to build up and prepare ourselves for that. This happens in phases. So we get the midlife phase, this is between the 40s and 60s. This is a sense of quest or crisis, motivated to make life or work more satisfying or gratifying. Liberation phase, typically the 60s, early 70s, involves translating the feeling of, if not now, when, into action. This is when people start to look at, what do I need to do? Now you guys know in the financial sector that this is when they just start looking at their finances, it's already too late. We know this. Summing up phase, shaped by desire to find a larger meaning, shared through storytelling, philanthropy, community activism. This is passing along. The encore phase. This is desire to make long-lasting contributions on a community or personal level, take care of unfinished business, and then celebrate one's contributions. This is normal retirement. Now what happens is people get stuck in some of these. People don't plan well enough, and they have to go back, and they should be moving forward, and that causes difficulties. There are a number of changes in retirement. Career path to a new self-made path. Time regimentation, you have 2,500 free hours all of a sudden. That's how much you guys work a year. It's only 40 hours a week, by the way. I know you guys work more than that. So it's more like 3,000 free hours. Work, you have time to be there, you have time to go home, you have appointments. Suddenly that just stops. Meeting deadlines to no deadline, imposed schedule to a self-imposed schedule, accountability to no boss, rat race to freedom of choice, and then built-in college to a new circle of friends. That's one of the biggest things. You know, when work, you spend most of your time with your people at work. You know, 8 hours a day, that's your social circle in a lot of places. And all of a sudden you have to change that. And that can be wonderful depending on where you work, or it could be a challenge. So the issues that start popping up, the issues that become a concern in retirement are medical issues, social and emotional issues, and then cognitive concern. We're going to kind of talk through all these different things, and we'll talk about elder abuse and capacity near the end here. Medical factors. So the medical issues that come up are multifaceted. Please know that none of these kind of happen in a vacuum. There's just overlap between many of these things. So we know that medical issues can affect cognitive abilities, can affect perception, insight into what's going on, impulse control, recent and remote memory. We know that cancer, cardiovascular disease, neurological disease, endocrinological disease, which is the diabetes, stroke, etc., dementia, delirium, all that can impact cognitive functioning. And we know that when cognitive functioning is impaired and goes down somewhat, people are at higher risk. We know that medication issues. How many of you have ever visited somebody in a nursing facility? How many of you have ever looked at their medication sheet? Sheets, plural. Multiple medications. Sometimes 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 pages of listed medications. And it's ridiculous to think that there's not overlap between those things. That's not impacting the person. Polypharmacy, muscle relaxants, anticholinergics, sedatives, narcotics, all have an impact on cognition. As we age, the body becomes much more vulnerable to any shift in its balance. When that shift in its balance takes place, that's where we start to have problems. The big one is delirium. So, delirium is rapid onset of mental status change. So, this is different from dementia in that it's rapid onset, and we'll talk about that coming up here. But that means that a person goes in the hospital, for example, and they were fine in the hospital, and then suddenly they're psychotic. Suddenly they're lashing out. Suddenly they're really mad, and they're screaming and yelling and hitting. That's a delirium. It's rapid onset. And that can be caused by all sorts of different things. We know that it's something physiological. We know that if we handle it, if we deal with whatever seems to be causing it, it will typically get better. So if a person comes into the hospital or they're at home and they get a urinary tract infection, for example, and we treat the urinary tract infection, any delirium should go away relatively quickly. The difficulty there is there's some current research going on out of Vanderbilt that says if we don't treat it immediately, that delirium can become what essentially starts off as a kickoff event. That is the instigator for further decline, and a person never fully recovers. And so what happens is they go in the hospital, and sometimes the doctors don't think it's a delirium, let's figure out what's going on. The person is psychotic, and so they give them an antipsychotic, right? But that doesn't treat it. All it does is it masks the symptom briefly. It usually just kind of snows the person out a little bit, and then we get a cognitive decline that becomes permanent as an instigator event. For your guys' line of work, when you see people making rapid, sudden changes in what they normally would want, this should be one of your thoughts. Is something happening medically? All sorts of reasons for delirium, dehydration, electrolyte imbalance. We know that people with cognitive decline, they forget to drink fluids. They think they've had enough, but they haven't had enough. So they get dehydrated. Their electrolytes get off. The big one in this is potassium. We know that if a potassium level gets too high, people will die from that. If it gets too low, people will die from that. There's like a really narrow range that potassium is supposed to stay in. And when it fluctuates outside that range, it can really mess with a person's cognitive status. Medications, especially things like Benadryl, and Benadryl and pain medications, can do tremendous damage to a person cognitively. Well, just think about the times that you've been sick and taken the Benadryl and you're sitting at your office going, oh man. It's the same thing, right? It's just that as we get older, we are more vulnerable to it. Pain. fever, infection, all these things. And we think these are relatively straightforward, simple things. In the older adult, these are problems, huge problems. Myocardial infarcts, arrhythmias, chronic heart failure, pulmonary emboli, and other medical conditions. Any imbalance to the person's makeup can cause difficulties. Some people are much more susceptible than others. Typically, if a person has one delirium, they are more vulnerable to having more deliriums. And so you just want to pay attention to that. Now, granted, you're not medical, but you do want to pay attention to that. You do want to say to the person, have you seen your doctor lately? Is there something we can do? You ask family members about this. Highest risk, the very old. And by the way, when I talk about older adults, I'm usually thinking age 70 and above. And older adults are really, we kind of lump them into one group. But the research really has them as old, middle old, and old. So just like we would never think of kids as just one group, there's children, there's pre-adolescent, there's adolescent, there's young adult. Same thing with older adults. There's no way a 60-year-old is the same as a 90-year-old. That 30-year span, the person has grown and developed and changed. And so we want to think about them differently. So we want to kind of divide people up as best that we can so that we're meeting their needs. Those with hearing loss and visual impairment, and it can occur in all sorts of places. Drugs, we talked about some of these. Some of the antidepressants. The problem with the antidiarrheal and the incontinence agents is that it just messes with the person's hydration balance. So that becomes a huge issue. And then there's a website where that research is going on, which is pretty fascinating work. So we have social and emotional risk factors as well. And we're going to talk a lot about depression. And if I just, get you guys to acknowledge this piece. Depression is not a normal part of aging. Older adults are not more depressed than younger ages. In fact, the research shows they're less depressed than younger ages. So this notion of, well, of course they're depressed, their friends are dying, everything's changing, they can't keep up, blah, 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 blah. It's BS, it's not true. The fact of the matter is that older adults adapt incredibly well. And they're less depressed than younger ages. So the DSM-5, DSM is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. It's kind of what we use to diagnose things. And all a diagnosis is a term to describe symptoms. That's all a diagnosis is. It's not negative, it's just this is what's happening, this is the term that goes with that. So for depression, for major depression, basically we're looking at symptoms present for at least a couple weeks, change from previous level of functioning, depressed mood, loss of interest or pleasure. And the key one is that it can't be due to a medical condition. So most of the day, every day, the person's depressed. Subjective report or made by others. Diminished interest in or pleasure in all or most activities nearly every day. Weight loss when not dieting. Insomnia or hypersomnia, so they're either not sleeping or they're sleeping too much. Psychomotor agitation, this is the people that are agitated when they're depressed. They walk around, they pace around a lot. Fatigue, feelings of worthlessness or excessive inappropriate guilt. Can't think or concentrate. Recurrent thoughts of death, not just fear of dying, by the way. Sometimes suicidal thoughts, we'll talk about that in a minute with older adults. Clinically significant distress, impairment of social occupational function, and then not due to a substance. So the problem with that is with older adults, late life depression is often related to physical functioning. So the comment is that it can't be due to a medical condition, kind of rules out older adults in a lot of ways. So it doesn't do a very good job of describing depression in older adults. So we have 1 to 3% of adults 65 and older meet the criteria for major depression. but about 15 to 25% report depressive symptoms. So we want to kind of separate some of that out, right? Depression that is clinically significant is impairing functioning in life. Depressive symptoms is, I had a bad week, I feel down, I'm struggling with this, and it's more transitory. So we want to kind of separate that out. One of the issues is, as we'll talk about, is that depression in late life puts a person at higher risk for developing Alzheimer's disease. And so we want to start paying attention to this. So in older adults, we're always trying to put emotional functioning, physical functioning, and cognitive functioning together. We want to look at it all within a package. And we know that vulnerability is to decrease in older adults because they get more adept with coping. But there's a biological vulnerability that goes in there as well. And there's some research that shows that if they have had depression early in life, they're much more vulnerable to developing depression late in life. So there's stressors at all ages of life. We know that certain stressors increase in life. We know that bereavement is an issue, caregiving responsibility. Now let's not rule out the caregiving responsibilities. We'll talk about this when we talk about Alzheimer's disease, but the research shows that roughly 60 to 70% of caregivers of individuals with Alzheimer's disease are clinically depressed. We also know that 60 to 70% of that group will die before their loved ones. So the caregivers will die before the person they're caring for. So this is significant. Older women are at greater risk. And sadly enough, this is kind of true across the board. Older women are at higher risk for Alzheimer's disease, higher risk for dementia, higher risk for anxiety. It starts to narrow late in life. And we also know that the socioeconomically disadvantaged are at higher risk as well. And a lot of that is due to just coping mechanisms. Negative life events, physical illness, bereavement, caregiving, social factors, cognition. And in older adults, what we see is less dysphoria, so less that kind of like sullen, not as much guilt, less suicidal ideation. We'll talk about that in just a second. But what we get is more of the somatic complaints. So more of the vague aches and pains, more of the GI difficulties, more of I just don't feel well, more I don't sleep well. It's more the physical stuff than it is the emotional stuff. And it interferes with personal care. So one of the things that I do is when I'm at the grocery store, if I see an older woman, for example, in the grocery store without her makeup on, I kind of almost automatically think something's up. Either something's going on cognitively or she's depressed. And the reason is because this current generation cohort that's in their 80s, they dress up to go everywhere. Everywhere. My generation is sweatpants and a t-shirt, and they don't care if it's clean. And they'll go out. The younger generation is shorts no matter what weather it is, and they go out. But the older generation, they dress up, put their hair on, makeup, everything to go out. So when you see a deviation from that, it might just be they don't really care, or it might be that something else is going on. And you want to pay attention to that. I did want to talk about suicide in older adults. And the reason is because most people don't realize that the highest suicide rate of all populations is white males over age 65. This is white males over age 65. Right there. Straight up. Everybody else kind of stays the same. We see that adolescents, a little bit of a bump. White males, stay up, boom, over age 65. We know that a huge percentage of those individuals have seen their physicians in the last 24 hours. We know that people who complete suicide typically don't talk about it. And it's something we need to pay attention to. So they only make up 13% of the general population and 25% of all suicides. 81% adultly commit suicide are males. 20% have seen a physician in the last 24 hours. 80% have seen their primary care physician in the last month. What you want to look at, it's okay to ask somebody, by the way, if they want to commit suicide. It's okay to ask somebody if they're going to hurt themselves. We tend to kind of stay away from that. We think that's kind of a touchy subject. But really, the way to address the touchy subject is just put it on the table. Right? Are you thinking of hurting yourself? And they'll say no. Are you thinking that you want this to end? Yes. Then we start exploring that, right? Highest risk factor for committing suicide, by the way, is gun ownership. That's just a fact. However you feel about guns, it's just a fact. Those that own guns commit suicide at much higher rates, and that's because they have the means by which to do it. And that's just factual. So what ends up happening is, as you explore this, you start looking at, are they having pain symptoms? It's incredibly difficult to live with chronic pain. It's incredibly difficult in our world to walk from your house to the car, to park, to walk to the front door to something when you're hurting all the time. We're just not made just to sit in one place. So when there's chronic pain, whether it's knees, hips, back, whatever, that increases that notion of, I am really just sick of this. There's a movie that just came out last year called Cake with Jennifer Aniston. Anybody see that? It's a fantastic movie that describes chronic pain. If you really want to know what chronic pain is like, watch this film. She does a wonderful job of really kind of looking at what it's like to just hurt all the time. And that becomes one of the biggest things. We know that social isolation becomes a huge risk factor in suicide. Those people that stay away from others, that becomes an issue. One of my professors in graduate school used to say, one of the reasons we have friendships is to keep us from slipping into psychosis. And it's true, right? Our friends become a sort of checks and balance to us. When we're down, our friends go, you know what? You've been through this before, you've made it through, we're fine, we're golden. Or they kind of go, really? Come on, let's keep going. And that helps us. When we isolate ourselves, we spend a great deal of time in our heads, and that becomes an issue. And then the depletion of the social web. So you really want to look at the social ecology. So you want to look at how the person's doing, just what has changed in the fabric of their makeup. And once you can start identifying that, you can identify what the risk factors are. Anxiety in older adults really haven't been overly recognized, but what we're seeing is that there's tremendous overlap in older adults with anxiety and depression. So what we get is an anxious depression. It's really kind of fascinating. And the reason you have to know that is because when you're treating it, you want to treat it as a depression, not so much as anxiety. But we know that people worry a lot. There's a lot of worries out there. And that worry gets so great, it impairs functioning, and then we call that anxiety. So, common anxiety symptoms, generalized anxiety disorder, panic disorders, obsessive compulsive disorder, hoarding. That's common, especially when you get the cognitive deficits going. And then mixed anxiety disorders. With regards to anxiety, though, when a person is anxious about something, what you want to do is you really want to normalize that for the person. Anxiety is normal. Anxiety is God-given. We are supposed to be anxious at times. If you're walking through a dark alley at night, or if you're watching the damn Royals in the 8th inning, your anxiety level goes up, right? That's kind of normal. When that anxiety level doesn't go back down, that's when it becomes abnormal. A panic disorder, all a panic attack is an anxious reaction to anxiety. A person feels anxiety, and they go, oh no, and it shoots up. So when people have panic attacks, they feel like their heart's palpitating, they're going to have a heart attack, they're sweaty, they're shaky. If we can get them not to be so worried about the anxiety, they won't have a panic attack. I realize that's pretty simplistic, but that's essentially what you work with when you're dealing with anxiety. Psychotic disorders, So inappropriate affect, disorganized behavior, delusions, hallucination. I do want to try to specify the difference between a delusion and an illusion. So this is especially true with older adults. So an illusion is this. I thought I put my watch here, and then I've come back and my watch is gone. So I assume it's been stolen. The maid was here earlier this week. Obviously, she took it. That's an illusion. Because what they've done is they've taken two pieces of information that don't quite match, and they put them together. The technical term is confabulation. And they put them together, they made the bridge, right? We do that on a normal basis every single day. We get one bit of information, we get a second bit of information, and we make a bridge between those pieces. That's normal function. So, if a person has cognitive deficits, they don't remember that, in fact, they may have picked it up and set it on the dresser. And so they assume that it's been stolen. That's an illusion. A delusion is, it's missing, it's been stolen, and those kids they just keep stealing from me. And they keep stealing from me, and I know they're taking my money. And there's a system to it. Does that make sense? When you hear that system going on, that's when you get into sort of paranoid thinking and stuff. And that's when you really want to try to separate that out. So an illusion doesn't need antipsychotic medication. An illusion just is, oh, we'll find it, and we'll deal with it, we'll work with it. When there's a system in place, it gets a little more complicated. Late onset schizophrenia is pretty rare, but it's much more common in women than it is in men. And oftentimes with the psychotic disorders, multiple physical complaints. Some of the dementias we'll talk about, so their key features are hallucinations. What's interesting is that some of those hallucinations they don't find frightening at all. We'll talk about that here in a little bit. Substance abuse with older adults. This is important to look at. There's a whole bunch of older adults who tell you that before they go to bed, they take a nip. Oh, it just helps me sleep. You need to clarify what the nip is. And the reason is because if I go home, I'm a big whiskey fan. I love whiskey. It's just nectar. And if I go home from work and I have a little glass of whiskey, that's an ounce of whiskey. So an ounce of whiskey is a glass of wine is a 12-ounce beer. It's an ounce of alcohol, essentially what it is. Some of these older adults, when they're talking nips, they're talking tumblers. I'm not exaggerating. Oh, I had a Jack and Coke, and it's like 3/4 Jack and 1/4 Coke. And they're drinking so much, the problem is they're becoming alcoholics, or they're keeping their alcoholism going. And that impairs cognitive functioning, and that impairs the medications. And we know that when a person drinks before they go to bed, usually in the middle of the night, their sleep is much more agitated. Well, they go to sleep wonderfully. But their sleep is much more agitated because it takes about an hour and a half to come off of an ounce of alcohol. Well, if this is normal functioning and alcohol is a depressant and I go down, when I come off of the alcohol, I will always agitate above normal. That's how the body works. When you come off of medication, it's the laws of physics. For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. It depresses me, makes me sleepy. When I come off it, I go above. That's agitation. And then they go back to normal. So if a person drinks a whole bunch before they go to bed, their sleep quality is always less. Now they will tell you they went to sleep just fine. But they'll have sweats, they'll toss and turn, all that stuff in the middle of the night. And they'll get up and use the bathroom, and then they'll explain that it's just being normal. Because older adults do get up and use the bathroom a little more often than actually a lot more often than other adults. So, well, you want to explore that. You want to know how much the person's drinking. Wernicke-Korsakoff syndrome. This is essentially alcoholic dementia. And what we know about alcoholic dementia is that when a person drinks so much, what happens is their thiamine levels in the body shift. And when their thiamine levels get so low, they develop Wernicke-Korsakoff syndrome. If we catch it early enough, and get them off of alcohol, give them a shot of thiamine, they'll be fine. They'll be gold. But if we don't, it becomes permanent, and this is where we get alcoholic dementia, and basically it is an extreme loss of short-term memory. These are people, I'm not exaggerating at all, they will introduce themselves to you 3 or 4 times in the first 10, 15 minutes that you meet them. It's like they don't even remember. It's like it didn't even happen. It's extreme memory loss. And it often extends back to when they started doing the heavy drinking. So if they've been drinking for decades, and it really kicks in, they may not remember the last decades. Yeah, it's sad. All right. Any questions about, we've gone medical concerns, and we've gone social and emotional concerns. Any questions so far? Okay, we're going to go into cognitive concerns. We'll take a break in a few minutes here, but let's go into cognitive concerns. Okay, so dementia. So dementia is not just one disease, and sometimes people don't realize what the difference is between like Alzheimer's disease and dementia. So what dementia is an umbrella term, and underneath the dementia moniker are multiple types of dementia. So underneath dementia as an umbrella term is Alzheimer's disease and vascular dementia, Parkinson's dementia, Lewy dementia. So it's kind of like cancer, right? Cancer is just an umbrella term, and underneath that is, breast cancer, lung cancer, and so on, right? So that's up. So dementia is an umbrella term. So when a person comes in and they have been told they have a diagnosis of dementia, basically what they've been told is we know something's wrong, but we're not quite sure exactly what. Okay? So what dementia is a shift from previous levels of functioning. Mental and behavioral disturbances, functional impairments, puts a person much more vulnerable to coexisting medical conditions, and they occur in a family and social context. It is a decline from previous levels of functioning. Now here's what's important about that, is if a person comes in and they see you and they've been extremely high functioning their whole life, and they come and see you and they're functioning in the average range, that's a decline. Similarly, if a person comes in and they have a history of being very low functioning, and they're still low functioning, that's not a decline, that's just low functioning. So you always want to have an idea of how the person was functioning before. Education is one of the ways to do that. Job history is another way to do that. Those are kind of the main ones. And then you got to kind of use, some nuance there. There are a lot of people who are not highly educated, but have done very, very well their whole lives, and they're just undereducated. They've done extremely well. So those are high-functioning people still. So you want to use a little bit of nuance there. So it's a decline from previous levels of functioning. Multiple areas of cognition are impaired. Everybody thinks memory. Memory is an important piece, but sometimes memory is not the key feature in a dementia process. So you're looking at memory, executive functioning, visual, spatial, all these different things. We'll talk about this coming up. Not all cognitive functioning is necessarily affected. Normal level of consciousness, this is what separates us from delirium. So vascular dementia. We'll run through vascular dementia and take a break. So vascular dementia is probably the second most common type of dementia. And it is caused by tiny strokes that take place deep in the brain. These strokes are called TIAs, and they take place in the white matter of the brain. Now what's important about the white matter of the brain is that's also the area that Parkinson's disease takes place, is in the white matter of the brain, deep down in the brain. And so the reason that that's important is that one of the things that we see with vascular dementia is changes in the person's gait. So there might be a little bit of shuffle in their step. You might see a little bit of a tremor even sometimes. Sometimes memory is not the key feature. We'll see some other stuff going on. Also, a key difference in vascular dementia is the way that it tends to progress. So it's called stepwise progression. So it looks like stair steps. So a person is doing well, then they drop off. When they're doing well, they drop off, just like a stair step would. The problem with that, when it's dropping off, the person is extremely vulnerable to being taken advantage of. Because it's during that phase that we will see them as psychotic, we will see them acting out, we will see aggression, we'll see agitation, we'll see all these different things, and that drop off. And that's oftentimes when family members or somebody without good intent will come in and take advantage of the person. Usually it's a little faster progression, 2 to 4 years, probably closer to 4 years until death. Confusion, problems with recent memory, wandering or getting lost in familiar places, that shuffling step, laughing or crying inappropriately. So these are people that they'll be happy and there'll be tears streaming down their face. They'll look like they're sad, but they're really happy. And that's just one of the symptoms here. And he's usually diagnosed with MRI. And sometimes these tiny strokes don't show up very well in a CT scan. So you have to get the MRI. We'll talk about Parkinson's. Let's take a 10-minute break. Is that right? We'll take a 10-minute break. We'll come back. We'll go into other dementias, Alzheimer's, and then we'll talk about capacity and elderly. So, all right.